Hello storytellers, welcome to Bound by Words. Today we are talking about how to nail the fun and game section in your novel. I'm really excited about this topic because sagging middle syndrome is one of the most commonly acquired diseases for novels. So this is a very important thing to go over. I also feel like there's not a whole lot of advice for the fun and game section outside of like plotting methods and outlining methods, and I think that there are some things that are universally good to know or be aware of either way. I will say I enjoy writing more as a pantser, even though I think I do better writing as a plotter, so I have both sides of the argument here. But even as a pantser, I know that being familiar with those story structures and those outlining techniques helps me, move forward and fight writer's block. So never too much knowledge to have, basically, when it comes to book structure and story structure and how to tell an interesting story. My name is Madie. If we haven't met yet, I am a full-time editor and a fantasy writer, and I spent a lot of time and money on a graduate level editing certificate from the University of Chicago, so I really love the idea of sharing all of that experience and time with you guys for free here on YouTube. So if that's something that you're interested in, if you're working on a novel and want to learn how to captivate your audience without having to get the degree, then make sure you hit the subscribe button and maybe like the video while you're down there. But we're gonna jump right into 3 strategies to help you nail the fun and game section, and then a couple of pitfalls that I see a lot of writers get snagged up in that keep their fun and game section from reaching its fullest potential. So first and foremost, I think the best thing that you can do for the fun and game section of your novel is to make sure that your character is both reacting and acting to certain things. There's a lot of talk in the storytelling community about character-driven stories versus plot-driven stories. A really good example of like a character-driven story that is popular is like The Hunger Games. We know our protagonists, and when we're describing what happens in the story, the movie, or the book, we're just describing how this person is choosing to handle certain things and how the choices that she's making are affecting both herself and her family and the games that she's involved in. And a good example of plot-driven stories are like The Lord of the Rings. When we talk about that story, we talk about a hobbit's journey to take this ring to a certain location. When we're summarizing the gist of that story, more of what we're going over is what he's doing, not necessarily him and the decisions he's making, like personally. And even though there is a bunch of good examples in each of these categories, we normally think of the action and reaction being more important in character-driven stories, but I think it's important in any story, especially in the fun and game section, because if your character is nothing but action and they're constantly just making a decision, and nobody else has to really react to what they're doing, it's like slashing through a jungle. They're gonna go through the whole story, the whole plot line, one side to the other without as much like conflict and resistance, and it's not going to be very interesting for your readers. The same thing happens if your character is constantly reacting. It's going to feel like things are happening to them and that they don't really have a voice, or maybe they just don't stand out as a character, and that's definitely not something that you want to happen. I read a book by an amateur writer once, and I really loved the book and I really loved like the trope and the tones, but it's just like seemed like everything was always happening to the main character and it was never her fault. Normally when you say that, it's a little sarcastic, like, and it's never your fault, and you know that like the character is just acting like it wasn't their fault. But in this case, it never actually was her fault. And it just was a little bit weird and two-dimensional, because even a nice and polite person, in this case like a royal, even if she was really well put together in general, she's gonna have moments behind closed doors where she's not, or she's gonna have moments where she's really emotional and reacts outside of the norm, because that's just what people do. And when we're writing stories and we're following these characters, we want to have like a realistic happening of like, this could be a real person, even though most of the time it's not. And I do know that there are some outlining and story structure methods that encourage like having an action and then a reaction and then an action and then a reaction, but I don't think it has to be so rigid. You can have 2 actions and then 2 reactions and then 1 and then 1, and you can really mix it up, but it's important that both things are happening. When you see a character for an extended period of time, like just constantly reacting to things, it really gives the impression that they're just struggling through life, and I think that's an important sort of like storytelling tactic that you can abuse a little bit. If you have action and reaction throughout the story and then there's just a segment where it's nothing but reaction, you know the character's in a rut. Or the same thing if it's nothing but action, you know they're on a roll. But if you go through your entire fun and games section in either one of those directions, it's gonna lack the depth and the tension and the suspense that we want to create. Now, the second strategy to make sure you're nailing the fun and game section and that your readers are engaged and hooked throughout the entire process is to stack and stagger your subplots. Now, there's some common advice out there that every scene should have at least 2 functions, and if it doesn't, then it either needs to be like added to create another function. And there are little ways to do this, you know, just making a word or a phrase meaningful or incorporating another character. You don't have to do anything like super dramatic usually to give it another, like a second or secondary purpose, or it should be merged with another scene. I don't think that that's always the case or that it's a cut and dry rule, but I will say that there's a lot of storytelling tactics that whenever you're like really looking into the science of what keeps things interesting and just real world examples of stories that are gripping, usually your scenes are going to have some sort of conflict or concern that involves 2 things. So frequently we hear like what the character wants and what they need. If your scene brings up both of those things, and it serves 2 purposes. So it's not a hard like box to check, but I will say that stacking and staggering your subplots is a really easy way to do that, because your subplots can be things that are very minimal, things that are going to happen whether you want them to or not, like a character arc and the way your character develops, or they can be something bigger like a romance subplot, or maybe a found family or a found just like friendship that these people are getting close or these people are falling apart. Those things are considered subplots even if you're not outlining them as subplots. Likely you'll have some things that happen in your story that the readers are gonna like take or interpret as subplots even if you don't mean it. But your subplots, they should stack or stagger, and what I mean when I say that is if you have a subplot that like starts and then ends, and then the next one starts and then ends, and then the next one starts and then ends, it's gonna be, I want to say, a little forced. Like it's gonna feel like we're just checking a to-do list off through the story. I don't have a lot of stories that really happens to. By the time they get to publishing, I feel like you work out a lot of those kinks, but in the earlier stages, I think it's something that not a lot of writers are really like aware or looking at. If you have subplots that sort of start and finish at the same time throughout the whole fun and game section, then you can just tweak the endings so that they overlap a little bit, because in the real world, we don't usually solve one problem before we move on to the next, unfortunately. They just keep coming and we resolve them as soon as we can. So it not only makes it a little bit more realistic, but it also increases the tension. You can have, you know, 2 subplots like wrap up, and then it'll give you like a nice little rest before you pick up the tension again. There's a lot of ways to play with that, and there's no right or wrong. But I will say as an editor that a lot of the manuscripts that I get that feel sort of checklist-like and less like I'm on an adventure with this character, usually one of the notes that I can leave is that your subplots sort of sit really rigidly, and it makes it almost seem like they're not there and they're part of the main plot instead. The third strategy that we're going to talk about today, and this is one of my favorite things to talk about because I just don't think it's mentioned very often, is equal or even pacing throughout your story. Now, it shouldn't be like the same exact pacing on every page or in every chapter, and Flurry, like always, is coming to visit and give his opinion, probably knock everything off my desk, but there should be a like general like median of pacing that your readers can expect as they're going through this story. If you have a very gripping and interesting inciting incident, which we spend a lot of time talking about this, especially just in the writing community, because more people start books than they finish books. So there's a lot of talk about the inciting incident, and because the climax is the most important, there's a lot of talk about that too. But if you have a fast-paced and exciting and a gripping inciting incident, and then your fun and game section, if you start thinking about it then as that slow climb up, you're gonna have this huge dip where your readers are gonna be bored for the first half of the fun and game section if you do that. That generic like story plot line that we're all familiar with, that little spike, is supposed to be like a graph of like the tension and the suspense. You should want to know more and more and more how the climax is going to turn out. It's not necessarily a breakdown of how fast or slow things should be moving. We don't want to have the pacing dip so low that our readers are bored, or they just don't know when it's going to pick up, or they're waiting for something to happen in a non-exciting way. And we don't want it to pick up to the point where our readers are constantly stressed out. I will say though, I tend to enjoy fast-paced books more. I know that's not everyone's cup of tea, but I love when I read 150 pages of a book and I'm just like, things just happen constantly. And like I said, I think this is just a mistake that people make because they think about the growing tension to the climax, and they think that that equates like the number of things that should happen. It should be maybe the severity of things that happen, but your character should be able to act and react and, you know, have those smaller issues along the way, and it might be part of your subplot, it might be part of your main plot. That doesn't matter as much. What matters is that you're delivering on the expectation of the reader. And if the reader reads 20 gripping pages of amazing, exciting incident and is thrown in this world and they're so excited, and then all of a sudden it slows down and not a whole lot is happening until, you know, 2/3 of the way through the book, they're gonna be disappointed. And now that he's fallen asleep, and I honestly almost can't believe he did, because usually he's like smacking my arm and throwing a huge fit, but now that he's asleep and it's peaceful, we can talk about 3 pitfalls that I see writers get snagged in all the time, that avoiding these things or being aware of them can help you write a better fun and game section. The first one is not having enough getting in the way. And I feel like a lot of this will relate to those strategies that we just talked about, but if you have a story where nothing gets in the way or minimal things get in the way of what you're happening, it is just going to be a little bit boring. And I hate to use that word to talk about stories because different worlds and different characters can be so exciting, but I distinctly remember, and I'm not going to say what the title is because I don't want to poison the well for anybody, but I remember reading this book, and what they say is going to happen in the beginning happens exactly as the characters like expected it to and like planned on it happening, and because of that, it just wasn't as interesting of a story. Now, if what your character is like planning happening in the beginning of the book actually happens in the end, that's totally fine. But if the way that it happens and the way that they get there happens exactly as they planned, then that's a sign that there's not enough tension or conflict. That's a sign that they weren't given anything to react to. They should have to replan and regroup once, or maybe they have to be taken out of their way a little bit. Nearly nothing in life just happens as easy as we want it to, so why would we let that happen in books? Especially when we're reading books because we want something a little bit more exciting than real life. So make sure that you have things getting in the way of your character, even if they're little. Make sure it's proportionate to, you know, what's going on in your story or maybe even your genre. Pitfall number 2 that people fall into is that your characters don't ever change. And this is the same as the story I mentioned before, where like everything happened to that one character and it seemed like she wasn't doing a lot of the action of it. And because that was so consistent throughout the entire story, it just read as two-dimensional. But the reason people still get snagged into this pitfall is because they think that they need to stay true to a character. They think that they need to like always have the character have the same, you know, personality or the same attitude. But in reality, we have this character who's living in this A world, this normal thing for them in the beginning, and they have the inciting incident pulls them into a different situation, which means they have no normal queued up reaction to what's happening. They have no normal way that they address those things that are happening to them because they don't normally happen to them. So it's okay if they fall out of character a little bit. And if you think about just like regular people, you can have times when you're just, you know, on a roll and like everything's together and work's going well, your place is clean, you're caught up on laundry, and then things get busy and you get a little bit stressed out and overwhelmed, and all of a sudden you have laundry piling up and you just don't feel like being social. And we're all familiar with little ruts like that where just life gets so busy and hectic and it almost feels like you just can't get on top of your game. And then eventually you get your life together a little bit and you pick things up, you get caught up on the laundry, you get cleaned up, you know, you start like going out or hanging out with people again or just making time for yourself. Those dips are not the normal. Like, they're the exception to the normal, but they happen to everybody. And usually they're things that people wish didn't happen, and it's just nobody's perfect. So like, don't write a perfect character. Make sure your character is either changing in attitude or tone. Either they have a character arc where they're developing either for the positive or for the negative, or they have things that they do that are just outside of what they would have normally preferred to have happened. Because that's just how we live life, unfortunately. We see that a lot in like argument scenes. Usually you have like two people who are getting really close, whether they're friends or they're romantic, and then some disconnect happens. Either there's a miscommunication or, you know, somebody feels disrespected or cheated, like lied to or whatever for whatever reason, and then there's an argument and then they storm off. Like, having an argument and like storming off might not be that normal reaction for that character, but it is a reasonable reaction to have. So make sure your characters are acting outside of their norm, because they're going to be meeting new people, they're going to be existing in new places, they're going to be going on this adventure, and they're not always going to know how to react. So make sure that they're not the same the whole story. And the last pitfall that we're going to talk about today, and this one's a little bit more serious, so I hope none of you fall into this trap, but having your fun and game section not be the premise of your story. And a lot of planning systems actually call this fun and game section the promise of the premise. However you sell your book, that is what this fun and game section is. So going back to the Hunger Games, when we talk about that, we talk about the games and we talk about all the trials that she has to do in the games. The inciting incident in the beginning there is just how she gets into the situation that is the premise. And then the conclusion is just how the premise resolves. So you really want to sell your book as what is happening in this fun and game section, which is why I think sagging middle syndrome is such a serious issue in books, because how are you going to market your book if the part that is the premise either isn't there or is weak? If you want to write a story about a person who travels the world, meeting a bunch of different mythical creatures, then you can't have them traveling in the beginning and then they meet a mythical creature and then the entire story is them and this one mythical creature going on this little quest in one country, and that's where like the whole fun and game section and the climax is. That's not the premise then. Like, the premise is gonna be whatever little adventure they went on. In the beginning part, they traveled the world and we're meeting mythical creatures might be the first sentence in the back of your synopsis, but it's not going to be like the meat of it. It's not going to be the important part. So if you are writing a book and you don't know how to talk about your book yet, because a lot of people fall into this category, especially during like the early drafting stages, if you don't know how to talk about your book yet, look at what you're going to be writing during the fun and game section, or maybe just wait until you get to the fun and game section if you are a pantser, and try to describe what's happening then. And in the reverse, if you have already written a book, make sure that however you're describing or marketing your book is the fun and game section. And because not a lot of people think about it like this, I think it's really easy to not make sure those two things match up. So this pitfall is really just taking the time to make sure the way you're marketing your book is what is happening in the middle. You want to like deliver on that premise. And like always, I want to hear down below in the comments what you guys recommend or some advice you have for your fellow writers for how you nail the fun and game section. Is there a certain way you edit? Is there a certain way you plot? Is there a certain resource that you recommend to other writers? I think it's invaluable to just share the things that have worked or haven't worked for you, because it's going to be a little bit different for everybody. And I think one of the best things people can do is just, you know, trial and error with themselves, and you get the inspiration for that trial and error from seeing what other people are doing. But with that, remember to like this video and please consider subscribing. I post writing related videos once a week, and I do have seasons of writing and productivity sprints.